Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Children of Light podcast. Today, Ethan and I are going to be finishing up Acts chapter 16 and starting Acts chapter 17. So, if you'll remember from last episode, Paul and Silas were in jail, and the jailer ended up getting converted after the earthquake that freed them. But they did not get released from jail. They are still in jail. And so, picking up from where we left off, we're going to see what happens next. So, Acts chapter 16, verse 35. Now, when day came, the chief magistrates sent their policemen, saying, "Release those men." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore, come out now and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are sending us away secretly? No, indeed, but let them come themselves and bring us out." The policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates. They were afraid when they heard that they were Romans, and they came and appealed to them. And when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. They went out of the prison, entered the house of Lydia, and when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. And so here we see the chief magistrates, which are basically the people in charge, um, send to release Paul and Silas because truthfully, they never had a trial, and so there was no real reason that they should have been in prison in the first place. The main reason that they put them in there was because um, they wanted to please the crowds and silence these two people um, that were kind of going against things that they believed in. And so they thought that we'll throw them in jail for a night, and that'll shut them up. They're not going to come out in fear of getting thrown back in. So even though we didn't give them a fair trial or anything like that, they're not going to be a problem to us any longer. So now we'll release them in the morning, all problems solved. Crowds are pleased. We did our job. Everything's going to go over well. Paul, on the other hand, has a very different idea. Um, and he uses a card that he doesn't use too often to get out of stuff, but it's the Roman card. One fact about Paul is that he is actually a Roman citizen. He was born a Roman citizen, which is not super common for the Jews. But Paul luckily has this, and he uses it multiple times in his life. And we see it here. We see it in Acts 22:25 to avoid an unlawful beating so that he can go back and preach in classic Paul fashion. And then he also uses his right as a Roman to appeal to Caesar later on after going on trial multiple times in Acts chapter 25, verse 11. So that's multiple times that we see Acts use his Roman citizenship to his benefit. But one important thing to know is that Paul does not use this to get out of persecution often. We see actually that Paul is in persecution very, very often and oftentimes unfairly, um, but he endures it for the sake of the gospel. But here, he uses this card to kind of get a one up on the chief magistrates. They're trying to send them away secretly, but Paul here says, "They have beaten us in public without a trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are sending us away secretly." Paul wants to continue on in this city, he probably definitely wants to get back to the house of Lydia. And with the chief magistrates just trying to shoo them out, he's not going to be able to do that. And so he here uses his Roman card, which puts the magistrates in fear of him, actually. It completely flips the table on them. And so now, when it's reported to them there in verse 38, says they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. Because the problem here is you cannot publicly beat a Roman citizen without a trial. Every Roman citizen has the right to a fair trial. Since they did not get a trial and were immediately just thrown in prison, that is a massive error on the magistrate's part, which could risk not only their job, but also this area it was supported by Rome, was a Roman colony, and so Rome could lose their support, which would be huge for them. And so they are afraid not only for their job, but also for really their city in general, because of what they've done to Paul. And so now they come and beg before him. They appeal to him, um, and they keep begging him to leave the city because they're like, we need this guy out of here. This is a risk to us, but they can't do anything too harmful, or else it's going to jeopardize them more. And so Paul and Silas now use this to their advantage, and they basically can now move around the city however they want. So they go to the house of Lydia there in verse 40 to encourage the brethren. I'm sure all these people are now newly converts, and seeing the people that they just kind of listened to and got converted from being thrown in prison for their beliefs, that would probably shake me up a bit if I am now following this same thing and see what the punishment for following Christ can be, being thrown in jail. That might shake my belief a little. And so Paul and Silas come here to them to encourage them to stay strong, um, and not fear the punishment that might be brought to them, or the persecution that might be brought to them. And so, after encouraging them, they finally depart from the city, probably much to the magistrate's relief, and continue on in their journeys. And so, Ethan's going to pick up here in chapter 17 to see where they go next.
Thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. I will jump into now. We get into chapter 17 of Paul and Silas arriving at Thessalonica now. So let me read the passage. It's going to be verses 1 through 9. That is where they are headed next now. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, This Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, along with a large number of the God fearing Greeks, and a number of the leading women. But the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar, and attacking the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people. When they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, These men who have upset the world have come here also, and Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. They stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things, and when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they then released them. So we go back now to verses 1 through 3. So Paul and Silas are now coming out of the house of Lydia. They're coming now on to their second journey, still in the middle of that. And they are now journeying through these 2 cities very quickly through the night as they get to Thessalonica, where there were already churches planted. There was a synagogue there, as we see. And as was Paul's custom, because he was Jewish, he spent 3 Sabbaths reasoning from the scriptures to the people there. He explains and he demonstrates that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. And he identifies Jesus as that Messiah. And as we see, that causes a massive uproar that some people who disagreed, they cause a mob. And we will get to that in a moment of where that leads to, because he proclaimed Jesus as the King, as the Messiah. So then we move to verse 4. And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul, along with a large number of God fearing Greeks and a number of the leading women. So in verse 4, we see kind of this response that some Jews are persuaded, a large number of Greeks are persuaded, and several prominent women. We do see that in some chapters here in Acts that there were a lot more prominent women in some of these areas because sometimes the men just didn't step up to be the leaders that they were supposed to be. So these were influential women, they were prominent leaders in the towns, in the Roman towns, and this the gospel through these people especially begins to spread quickly among the Gentiles in these socially influential areas of the city with these influential people. So these leading women were actually massive causes in the gospel being spread through these Gentile cities. And then we get to verse 5 of the mixed response, of the negative response here. In verse 5, but the Jews, they were becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar and attacking the house of Jason. They were seeking to bring them out to the people. So the Jews, God's chosen people, reacted very negatively to this. They did not like this. They were super, super jealous. And they gathered essentially a bunch of low life nobodies from the marketplace to cause this mob of an uproar to bring Paul and Silas out and their team to the people so they could be persecuted, beat, probably try to get stoned. They created an uproar in the city and then they targeted the house of Jason, which we know that is where Paul and Silas were staying. And then we get to verses 6 and 7. They obviously searched Jason's house. And it says in verse 6, when they did not find them, they began to drag Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, these men who have upset the world have come here also. And Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king. And obviously, we know what does that say next? That king was Jesus. In verses 6 and 7, Paul and Silas, they can't be found. They search Jason's house. They're like, where are these two? We want them to come out now. And obviously, Jason wasn't going to let them. He wasn't going to show them where they were truly. So Jason and these brethren that are with him, who are helping him hide them, they get punished for it. They get dragged out with, they get all dragged out together by this mob and brought before the city authorities. They accuse them of causing this uproar, this unrest through the world, and acting against Caesar's decrees by proclaiming Jesus as another king, even though he is the only king. Back in this day, Caesar was like Rome's lord and king to them. He was their Messiah at this time. That's who they looked at him like. But of course, we know, and Jason and the brethren knew, our true king and our true Lord is Jesus Christ. And that's what we need to understand today. That's some practical application to take from this passage is understanding Caesar is not our king and he was never their king. Our true king is Jesus Christ. And then verse 8 shows the effect of these accusations. They stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. So this effect, it stirred them up. It got them more and more upset. The crowd, even the city officials, they're they're very disturbed by these charges that came up, by the uproar that happened, particularly the claim that there was a rival king in Jesus, which would have been taken extremely seriously, as I just discussed, in a Roman city under Caesar. That was taken very seriously. And then we get to verse 9. Verse 9 says this, and when they had received a pledge from Jason and the others, they then released them. So in verse 9, we see that Jason and these brethren with him, they were required to provide something like they weren't going to cause this to happen again, like don't do this again. This was probably some sort of a financial thing, some sort of a financial bond of some sort before being released to show that they wouldn't try and do this again for their own protection. And this placed this responsibility on them and increased their pressure of getting Paul and Silas now out of the city. They needed to get them out so they wouldn't be found and persecuted and beat. So, in our next episode, we're going to see where Paul and Silas end up going.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ethan, for that. So, yeah, like he said, we're going to continue on in Acts chapter 17 in our next episode. But that's going to wrap it up for today. So, thank you guys so much for listening in and have a great day.